Imagine a perfectly ordinary morning. You wake up, you reach over to turn off the alarm, and your phone screen lights up with a breaking news alert. A massive, coordinated military strike has just occurred halfway across the world. It is in a region you probably only think about when you are standing at the pump, watching the numbers tick up. So you look at the headline, you blink away the sleep, and it feels distant. It feels abstract. A tragic event, perhaps, but a world away from your bedroom. But here's the reality. Before you have even stepped out of bed, before you have poured your first cup of coffee, the invisible machinery of the global economy has already shifted beneath your feet.
It happens fast, in an instant, because while you are reading that headline, in a high-rise office in London, a marine insurance underwriter is staring at a glowing screen. They are reading the exact same news. They take a breath. They do the calculation. Geopolitical temperature, probability curves, and they hit a button that reprices the cost of risk in a distant, sun-baked gulf. And that single keystroke travels at the speed of light to the bridge of a ship halfway across the globe.
Right. Thousands of miles away from that desk, the captain of a steel leviathan, an oil tanker carrying more liquid wealth than the entire GDP of some small nations, receives an urgent transmission. The captain stands on a bridge high above the water, looks out at the horizon, and gives an order. They throttle back the massive engines. They drop anchor. Steel chain screams as it runs. And then the ship just sits. A handful of these giant ships hesitate. They idle, staring down a narrow waterway they traverse every single week. But suddenly, they are unwilling to cross an invisible line drawn by fear and by liability.
And here's the thing, that hesitation cascades. Shipping schedules start to slip, first by hours, then by days. Companies scramble for new insurance terms. Crews ask hard questions, and suddenly, without a single barrel vanishing from the earth, without a single well running dry, the price of the fuel you put in your car starts to move. The cost of goods lining your local shelves begins to adjust. You are paying the price for a conflict you have nothing to do with, dictated by the geography of a place you may never visit.
So, how can a narrow strip of water move your costs at home? Welcome to Profoundly Curious. Today's episode is Hormuz, How 21 Miles Control Global Oil. I'm Connor Hale.
And I'm Ava Langford. A quick note before we begin. The co-host's voice for this episode is AI-generated. The research, script, editing, and production were directed by the creator.
To understand the sheer gravity of the situation, you have to look at the map. You have to strip away the politics, the rhetoric, and the daily news cycle, and look at the stark physical reality of the Earth itself.
We are talking about the Strait of Hormuz. It's a strip of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and ultimately out to the open ocean of the Arabian Sea. But honestly, calling it a strip of water does a massive disservice to its scale and its deeply claustrophobic nature. It's a short piece of geography, but it behaves like a valve.
When you look at it from a satellite view, it looks like a pinched nerve in the global anatomy. It's roughly 100 miles long, but the metric that keeps strategists and traders awake is its absolute narrowest point. Between the rocky mountainous coast of Iran to the north and the jagged Musandam Peninsula of Oman to the south, the strait is a mere 21 miles wide.
21 miles. Think about that for a second. In the vastness of the world's oceans, where ships normally have thousands of miles of open blue water to navigate, 21 miles is nothing. It's a needle's eye.
21 miles is it's a morning commute for a lot of people. You can drive that in half an hour. And yet, this incredibly tiny geographical bottleneck is where the modern world concentrates an astonishing share of its energy lifeblood. It's a choke point, and I mean it literally. A choke point is a narrow geographic feature that forces traffic into a confined space, making that traffic vulnerable to disruption or control.
And the Strait of Hormuz is the quintessential choke point. Because of its extreme narrowness, The International Maritime Organization cannot just let ships sail freely through it like an open lake. They have to enforce what is called a Traffic Separation Scheme, or a TSS.
A maritime highway, basically.
That's it. You can picture it like an interstate highway painted onto the surface of the water. Within that 21-mile physical gap, the actual designated shipping lanes, meant for the world's largest commercial vessels, are astonishingly tight. They are only 2 miles wide in each direction. You have one 2-mile lane for traffic going inbound into the Persian Gulf, and one 2-mile lane for traffic coming outbound. And separating those 2 lanes is a mandatory 2-mile buffer zone to prevent head-on collisions.
So out of that 21-mile gap, all the massive heavy traffic is squeezed into just 6 miles of highly regulated water. 6 miles carrying the absolute lifeblood of the modern industrialized world.
And we also have to consider what lies beneath the surface of those 6 miles. It's not just about the width. It's heavily dictated by the bathymetry, which is the topography and depth of the ocean floor. The vessels moving through the strait are not speedboats or coastal ferries. We are talking about ultra-large crude carriers, ULCCs.
To give you a sense of scale, a ULCC can be well over 1,000 feet long. That is longer than 3 football fields laid end to end, or roughly the height of the Empire State Building laid on its side. And when they are fully loaded with oil, they are incredibly heavy. They draft deeply.
Which means it can't improvise. The deepest navigable waters, the kind these leviathans need when they're fully loaded, tend to run closer to the southern side near Oman. Move north and the seabed shallows. So a deep draft tanker can't just swerve out of a 2-mile lane when trouble appears.
If they try to swing wide toward the north to avoid an obstacle, they run the catastrophic risk of running aground. And a fully loaded ULCC running aground isn't just a traffic delay. It is a catastrophic spill risk and a total blockage of the channel. They're geographically trapped. They are forced into a highly predictable, incredibly narrow trench.
So, we have established the physical reality. A tiny, predictable, constrained corridor. Now, we have to talk about the stakes. We have to look at the sheer volume of energy being forced through that tiny valve every single day.
The numbers here are almost difficult to comprehend. In recent years, roughly 20 million barrels a day of petroleum liquids have moved through Hormuz. That's crude. That's refined products.
To put that in perspective, a barrel is 42 gallons. 20 million barrels is about 840 million gallons. Every single day. At that scale, the right comparison is not a tanker truck or a storage tank. It is a river, or basically the entire daily fuel consumption of the United States, through a set of lanes only a couple miles wide.
And this is where the number turns into leverage. More than a quarter of the world's seaborne traded oil moves through this one choke point.
And it's not just oil. LNG, liquefied natural gas. Around 1/5 of the world's LNG trade relies on this single exit route, primarily massive supercooled cargoes from Qatar. When you stack crude oil, refined products, and LNG on top of each other, you are looking at a concentration of global energy dependency that is unmatched anywhere else on Earth.
People often bring up other famous canals or straits. They think about the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal, or the Strait of Malacca over in Asia. And yes, those are vital arteries for global trade. They move millions of shipping containers full of electronics, clothes, and manufactured goods. But none of them, absolutely none of them, carry the specific, unyielding, highly concentrated volume of primary hydrocarbon energy. Hormuz is in a category of its own.
When you have that much volume forced through a space that tight, you have a profound structural vulnerability in the global economy. And to truly understand how that vulnerability can be exploited by geopolitical actors, we need to kill a Hollywood misconception.
Look, when people hear the strait is closed, they picture a movie blockade. They picture an enemy sinking a line of ships across the channel to create a literal, physical wall of steel. Or they picture a massive iron chain stretched from the coast of Iran to the coast of Oman. But that is fundamentally not how a modern choke point is disrupted.
In the modern, highly financialized era of global shipping, Disruption operates on a sliding scale. We can break this down into a framework of 3 distinct frictions. 3 ways to choke the choke point.
Let's unpack the first one. The first is physical restriction. This is the baseline reality we just spent time detailing. The literal, unforgiving geography. It's the narrow 2-mile lanes. It is the shallower margins that punish deep draft ships.
And the weapons that exploit that geometry. Shore-based missile batteries hidden in mountainous terrain, mines, swarms of fast attack craft stationed along jagged coastlines, and drones that can arrive with almost no warning. The physical restriction means the geography itself has already done half the work of cornering the prey. The key is not that every ship gets hit. The key is that the threat is credible.
The second friction is operational delay. This is where things start to get psychological. What happens when the threat level rises, but the strait isn't physically blocked by sunken ships? The answer is that ship captains don't just blindly sail their multi-million-dollar vessels into a potential war zone.
They're ordered by their corporate managers sitting in boardrooms in Geneva or Singapore to stop. They are told to wait for clarity, so these massive vessels drop anchor, burning fuel to keep generators running, while someone on shore tries to decide whether this voyage is still survivable on paper.
Or they wait to form slow-moving convoys that can be escorted by naval warships.
And here's why that matters to you. When you force vessels to travel at slower convoy speeds, or force them to sit at anchor for days on end, you're slowing the velocity of global trade. Slower traffic means fewer barrels of oil are reaching markets on schedule. Supply chains are optimized to the day, sometimes to the hour. When that schedule breaks, the available supply shrinks.
Which brings us to the third, and undoubtedly the most powerful friction of all, financial friction. The invisible wall we touched on in Episode 1, insurance, coverage terms, premiums that turn profit into loss. This is fascinating because it happens entirely on paper, miles away from the ocean.
You can't sail a $100 million ship carrying $100 million worth of volatile cargo without insurance. It violates lender terms, corporate policy, and charter requirements. Specifically in these scenarios, we are talking about war risk insurance.
War risk insurance is specialized coverage for acts of war, conflict, terrorism, state seizure. It's separate from standard hull and machinery coverage, and is often required as a condition for a ship to enter a zone that underwriters have deemed high risk.
The history of this kind of insurance actually dates back centuries to merchants meeting in London coffee houses like the famous Lloyd's Coffee House and Jonathan's Coffee House, pooling their money to share the risk of sending their East Indiamen, the armed cargo sailing ships purpose-built for the voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to the East Indies.
Today, it's governed by massive financial syndicates, but the core principle remains the same. If a ship owner cannot secure war risk coverage, or if the premium becomes so expensive that it erases the profit from the voyage, the ship does not sail. Period. The captain stays at anchor. The cargo stays in the tanks.
The financial friction acts like a tourniquet on the flow of global trade before a single physical shot even needs to be fired. That's the soft closure.
And this leads us directly to the terrifying speed of global commodity markets. We have to understand that markets do not wait for a physical shortage of oil to manifest before they raise prices. They don't wait for your local gas station to run out of fuel. They price in the expectation of a shortage. They price in the probability of disruption. They price in fear.
And look, none of this is theoretical. We have watched the Gulf do this before, in real time, with real ships and real consequences.
In the late 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, commercial tankers started getting hit. The route itself turned into a battlefield. That period is literally remembered as the Tanker War. And here's the part that matters for Hormuz. You don't need to sink a fleet to change behavior. A handful of attacks, a few credible threats, even a small number of sea mines. And suddenly every shipowner has to ask the same question. Do I risk the transit or do I wait?
Which is when governments get pulled in, because the market can't insure its way through a war zone.
Right, so in 1987, the United States began escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf in an operation called Earnest Will. The point wasn't to make ships invincible, it was to make the voyage commercially possible again by changing the risk picture. On the very first convoy, a tanker struck a mine. No dramatic blockade, no chain across the water, just a cheap device in the right place, and the entire system got a lot more honest about how fragile it was.
And it escalated from there. In April 1988, the U.S. frigate Samuel B. Roberts hit a mine and was badly damaged. Days later, the U.S. launched Operation Praying Mantis, striking Iranian forces in the Gulf.
So the takeaway isn't history repeats exactly. The takeaway is the mechanism. Hormuz doesn't need to be sealed shut like a door, it just needs enough uncertainty that rational people stop walking through it.
Not closed, not really, but closed enough.
And that's why the word closure is slippery. A strait can be open on a map and closed in the balance sheet.
In modern Hormuz scares, oil markets can react fast. Prices move not because the oil vanished, but because the probability of disruption suddenly has to be priced.
The oil didn't vanish. The expectation shifted. Now you might ask, how do we know what's happening out there? How do we see the valve tightening?
Well, we don't guess. We track signals. Physical flows are monitored and analyzed by agencies like the U.S. Energy Information Administration. Operational behavior shows up in AIS tracking data, the Automatic Identification System.
Basically, a ship's digital handshake. Most large commercial vessels broadcast identity, position, speed, and course.
On public AIS maps, you can see it. Clusters of ships loitering, queues forming, speeds dropping. When you see dozens of large vessels doing the same weird thing at the same time, that's not noise. That's the system reacting. You can literally watch vessels anchor, reroute, or bunch up.
And analysts layer in other signals. Satellite imagery, port loadings, tanker tracking firms, even public data from agencies that watch flows for a living. You don't need a spy novel. The supply chain is chatty if you know where to look.
And the financial friction is equally visible if you know where to look. Insurance terms, war risk quotes, futures, freight rates. The system leaves footprints.
What remains uncertain and what drives enduring panic is that no model can perfectly predict the duration or escalation of a geopolitical standoff.
Which brings us to the mechanics of a modern Hormuz scare. Our focus here is maritime, not politics, not moral verdicts, just the consequences on the water.
In the first days of a serious scare, the pattern is familiar. Warnings to commercial traffic, a rapid deterioration in the commercial risk picture, and then the first reports of damage or near misses.
At that point, the threat stops being theoretical, and the insurance market reacts accordingly.
Here's the math of the invisible wall. Before a crisis, war risk might be quoted around a fraction of 1% of a ship's insured value. In a crisis, quotes can jump to 1%, 2%, even more depending on the ship, the cargo, the route, the timing.
And percentages at that scale are not abstract. If a ship is valued at 150 million, 1% is 1.5 million. 2% is 3 million for a single transit.
And if you can't obtain coverage at all, you don't move, not if you want to stay in business.
In moments like that, governments sometimes reach for a lever most people don't associate with maritime war zones. They try to backstop the financial risk, or they signal naval escorts to make insurers and ship owners believe the voyage is survivable on paper.
That is a direct attempt to attack the third friction, the financial one. If private underwriters won't write it, the government tries to change the equation.
And it points to something deeper about how choke points reopen. You don't defeat the geography. You restore commercial permission, coverage, contracts, confidence that the voyage won't bankrupt the owner.
And then there's the convoy idea. Escort talk is, in a way, a 20th century solution. Ships move together under protection because lone ships are easier to pick off.
The catch is that convoys are slow, complex, and escalatory. And in a crisis, the words matter almost as much as the hardware. A single shift from no escorts to escorts as soon as possible can change what ship owners decide to do.
Which tells you policy signals matter almost as much as missiles. If markets believe the backstop is real, the invisible wall can soften. If they don't, the wall stays up.
Okay, so if the front door to the Persian Gulf is effectively bolted shut by this invisible wall of financial and physical risk, the immediate logical question is there a back door?
If you can't sail out through Hormuz, can you go around? Can you detour?
This is where Hormuz is different from the Red Sea. When the Bab el-Mandeb and Red Sea became too risky, ships had an awful but viable alternative. They could go around the Cape of Good Hope.
It's a massive detour. It adds 10 to 14 days to a voyage, it burns expensive extra fuel, and it disrupts port scheduling. But fundamentally, cargo still moves from point A to point B. The supply chain bends under pressure, but it doesn't snap.
Hormuz has no Cape of Good Hope. The Persian Gulf is a geographical cul-de-sac. If the strait is effectively shut, ports inside the Gulf are severed from the ocean.
The only alternative is overland pipeline infrastructure. And yes, the Gulf states have built some bypass capacity. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, the UAE pipeline to Fujairah.
But a pipeline bypass is not the same as replacing Hormuz. Nameplate capacity isn't spare capacity, and even optimistic estimates leave a massive gap between what the strait normally carries and what can be rerouted on land, which means the deficit stacks up fast. Tens of millions of barrels over a week.
Let's put real numbers on that, because this is where people talk themselves into false comfort.
Roughly 20 million barrels a day move through Hormuz. The main bypass options are meaningful, but they're not a substitute. The East-West pipeline can move on the order of 5 million barrels a day to the Red Sea, and the UAE's pipeline can send roughly 1 to 2 million barrels a day to Fujairah outside the Gulf. But spare capacity is the whole game. Pipelines aren't always sitting empty. Ports have limits. Storage has limits. Tankers have to be available on the other side. So even if you can bypass a few million barrels a day, you're still left with a very large shortfall if Hormuz really tightens.
And LNG is worse. You can't just pour LNG into a pipeline.
Hold on. LNG is a liquid. So why can't you just push it through a pipeline the way you do with oil?
Because LNG only stays LNG if you keep it cryogenically cold. It's natural gas chilled down so far it becomes a liquid. A normal pipeline network is built to move gas at ordinary temperatures under pressure, not an ultra-cold liquid that wants to boil back into vapor. To move LNG by pipeline over distance, you'd need a totally different kind of system, basically refrigerated, heavily insulated cryogenic infrastructure end to end. And if you don't have that, for places like Qatar, the ship is the pipeline. If carriers don't transit, those cargoes are stranded.
So even if some crude finds a detour on land, the gas side can still pinch fast. Qatar's LNG cargoes still need an open sea lane.
Right. Now here's another uncomfortable truth. The pain isn't evenly distributed. Most of the oil and LNG moving through Hormuz goes to Asia, China, India, Japan, South Korea. That matters because those are industrial economies with continuous energy demand.
And because global energy markets are linked, that stress doesn't stay regional. It becomes a price signal everywhere.
Higher energy costs hit factories, shipping, trucking, the cost of moving and making almost everything. A 21-mile crisis exports inflation.
Because the stakes are so high, the flow of information during a crisis like this becomes overwhelming. Headlines are designed to induce urgency. In a tense standoff, they can induce panic. To navigate this, you need a mental toolkit, a headline filter. When you see a terrifying Hormuz headline, ask 4 questions.
1. Is it physical, operational, or financial friction? Are ships being hit? Are vessels anchoring? Or did insurance tighten?
2. What changed on the water? Flows stopped or schedules slowed? A delay is bad. A stoppage is different.
3. Who is confirming it? Look for data. Maritime advisories, AIS patterns, and operator behavior, not just rhetoric.
4. What would it actually take to end it? De-escalation? A credible security posture? A financial backstop that insurers trust?
Okay, let's step back. What did we really cover today? Leverage. The Strait of Hormuz holds an almost incomprehensible amount of leverage over the global economy, not only because of what physically flows through it, but because modern markets price the risk instantly.
A VHF warning, a projectile strike, a line in an insurance contract, a premium quote that can freeze traffic before a classic blockade ever forms.
Which leaves the big question. If the modern world has built itself around a 21-mile vulnerability, then we're looking at an economic system built on hyper-optimized efficiency, underpinned by profound structural fragility. So we have to ask, how resilient is the global economy we have built? And what would real resilience look like? Physical alternatives, financial backstops, operational plans that work when the map turns hostile.
And if there's one takeaway, choke points don't have to close in steel to close in practice. In the modern world, the first blockade is usually financial. Thanks for listening to Profoundly Curious. You can follow the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, and we'll see you next time.